Hi, my name's Michael and welcome to Today Dreamer, a podcast and YouTube channel that examines the interplay between inner work and outer work. Through conscious conversations and practical walkthroughs, we'll be exploring ideas and practices to help you find a deeper sense of clarity, develop your focus, and take meaningful action. I hope you love the show. Welcome back to the Today Dreamer podcast. It's been an interesting last couple of weeks for me on a personal level. I've stepped away from the podcast to take a bit of a breath. And I feel like during this kind of seemingly chaotic time, it's worth pausing and just taking a breath and slowing things down for a moment. I use that time to work on my relationships, give them some extra kind of attention, and to kind of sit with my relationship with myself as well. And it's been nice kind of stepping away from the grind of things, the churning of the machine, and just pausing for a moment to kind of get a bit of clarity. Today's guest is Wescott Louden, who is the host of a YouTube channel called Enlighten, and a mutual friend of ours put us in touch. And I'm so happy that he did, because we got along really well and we got to reach some really interesting places and cover some interesting topics, including altered states, dreams. We spoke about religion. We also spoke about his book, The Way of the Dream. So sit back, guys, relax and enjoy the latest episode of the Today Dreamer podcast. There's going to be some really exciting ones to come. And I hope that you're getting something out of these episodes and you're really kind of engaging with the conversations in an exploratory, open, and practical way. You're experimenting with some of the things that you're hearing and you're getting something out of the show. If you are, consider subscribing and maybe sharing an episode that you like with a friend of yours to help them on their journey as well. But yeah, let's get into this conversation with Westcott. But yeah, it sounds quite intriguing as well, to be honest. And that's something that I guess I wanted to touch on with you, is these elements of ancient civilizations or cultures, and their ways of, in one way or another. And it's strangely connected between all the kind of traditional Aboriginal people of the lands across the world, is their way of kind of reaching these holotropic states and meaningful insights from that. And then, because they haven't had really much in the way of the kind of technology that the modern world does, but they've found a way to find meaning and kind of move forward. So I was wondering if we could maybe use this as a launching pad to talk about that. But just before we do, usually the way I start the shows, or what I've been doing recently, is just inviting kind of everyone listening and the guest to take a couple of breaths with me, just so we can kind of, I guess, settle into the space and just kind of pause for a moment. Would you be open to doing something like that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So everyone out there and you out there and Westcott, I would really appreciate if you were open to this experience. And let's take a couple of breaths together so we can really just kind of pause for a moment. No matter what's been happening during your day, no matter, what you've been experiencing recently, I think it's always kind of a useful thing to be able to pause and come back to, even just for a moment, just a state of stillness, and kind of see where that takes us with this sense of openness and willingness to kind of sink into the moment. So let's close our eyes together, if that's okay, and take a couple of breaths in through the nose using the diaphragm, and trying to kind of maintain a sense of calmness, smoothness, and consistency. And as you feel ready, slowly open your eyes, and I guess let's get into things.
Mm. That's a nice thing to do. You know, I've done a few interviews, and I find always when you set up all the camera equipment, you get the computer working, you're a little bit anxious, you know, and you're in an anxious space. And just doing a little meditation, that is nice. Just alleviates the anxiety of getting everything working and set up, and allows you to just relax.
Yeah, I was doing it for a while, for quite a while, just on my own, and it was like a little ritual because I got quite frantic, but running around, setting everything up, making sure that I, wasn't disrespecting the guests by being late, or sometimes we have technical difficulties like you and I had today. So yeah, it is nice just to kind of give things a bit of a reset, and I find it's nice to just do it when I notice that my mind seems to be quite chaotic, just to kind of give it a bit of a reset and come back to just the moment that I'm in. As kind of silly as that may sound, it's a nice thing.
Yeah, it gets you into a baseline state of awareness for sure.
So I did want to kind of explore this notion of these ancient cultures. You mentioned the Sundance a bit earlier, and it's only one that I've come across in the last couple of days since talking to Marinik, to be honest. And definitely find these rituals, I guess, quite intriguing, especially because it allows us to enter a space, this space of almost like a space between worlds, between this kind of version of reality that we're all in, and the other side of things. And it's kind of become clear to me that having a foot in both worlds allows us to kind of move forward, for me anyways, in a more meaningful way. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what got you so interested in these, the ways that traditional, or I'm not really sure how to label them, but ancient cultures or Aboriginal people have reached a holotropic state through what seems to be quite common or similar practices.
Yeah, it's interesting in my case how it came about, because that was never my goal. I was never really trying to find anything out about Aboriginals or traditional spiritual practices.
Hi, my name's Michael, and welcome to Today Dreamer,
a
podcast and YouTube channel that examines the interplay between inner work and outer work. Through conscious conversations and practical walkthroughs, we'll be exploring ideas and practices to help you find a deeper sense of clarity, develop your focus, and take meaningful action.
And then when she shared this with me, it was clear to me that she was telling me the truth, and there was no doubt in my mind that for her, this was a real experience. And so my goal was to really make sense out of religion and to try and figure out what it is that allows religion to persist in the modern world. I mean, I really consider myself a scientific person. In fact, I think I've upset some of my subscribers because I'm very skeptical. Recently I released a video criticizing Graham Hancock and some of his ideas and the ancient alien theory. I am a very skeptical person. And so I thought that would be really useful to take that mindset and to try and approach religion from that angle. I just didn't feel that really anybody was doing that, or anybody was really interested in doing that. I thought, we have such a great understanding of physics, a great understanding of chemistry, astronomy, all these things, but why is it that there's no serious academic research that's trying to sincerely understand the religious experience? That really confounded me. I mean, you think, there's scientific specialists out there who will study a little nematode for their whole life, and spend countless hours researching the most tiny microorganisms, and yet we completely ignore and neglect to seriously scientifically investigate the religious experience. And as a teenager, that got me excited because I thought, well, here is a whole bloody frontier that I can kind of pioneer. You know, I'd heard so many stories about Isaac Newton and Galileo, and I thought, man, wouldn't it be great to be remembered as one of these guys that pioneered a new avenue of science or something like this, right? That was my teenage mindset with it. But when I got older, I just got frustrated because it was so bloody confusing. And of course, approaching Christianity, that really put me off because, you know, that critical, skeptical mindset of mine really came up against all these roadblocks of problems in the Bible, problems with the church, problems with doctrine and dogma. And a lot of it just doesn't make sense, right? And so I really, in a big way, I gave up on all of it. I said, you know what, the atheists are right. It's all a bunch of hooey. There's nothing to be found here. And I sort of walked away from it. And it was right around that time that a friend of mine introduced me to Joseph Campbell and the hero with 1,000 faces and the ideas of perennialism. And I listened to Joseph Campbell's series Mythos, and it was just it was like a light bulb moment, you know, or it was just, wow, you know, this really does make sense. And what I really came to realize as I, you know, took what I had learned and started applying it to different areas and continuing to read is that, you know, dreams really form the center of religious experience. Without dreams, you really don't have any sort of religion. And when you talk about, as you mentioned before, you know, psychedelic states, holotropic states, altered states of consciousness, all of these really seem to take someone into a dream state while they're awake. So one of my favorite authors, Dr. David Lewis Williams, in his book, The Mind in the Cave, he has this diagram called the spectrum of consciousness. And he explains how most of the time we start in a waking state, like the state we're in now, and then we progress further and further along until we enter an unconscious state. And it's usually in this sort of unconscious state while we sleep that we tend to experience dreams. Whereas religious methods, specifically in his case, in the book that he wrote, he's talking about the San Bushmen of South Africa. He says, you know, what they're doing is they're following what he calls an intensified trajectory, in which they're essentially entering the unconscious mind without losing awareness, without slipping into a state of unconsciousness. So it's almost like staying awake as you enter a dream. And this is in some sense what psychedelics do as well. You know, I know in my own case, when I've done LSD, and the thing that really overwhelms you is the sense that, my God, I'm dreaming. You know, you really feel it. It's you look at the world around you, and it feels dreamlike in nature. And so this is an area of consciousness that Aboriginal peoples and traditional societies have explored much more than we have, and in large part, it's due to the fact that that was really the only method they had for obtaining knowledge about the world. I mean, in our modern scientific society, we have access to so many tools, telescopes, microscopes, math, you know, physics, all these different things. We can use all these tools to understand the world around us. But, you know, for somebody living in ancient Egypt or, you know, ancient Mesopotamia, right, you don't have access to any of that. And so altered states of consciousness were really their mainstay for trying to make sense out of the world. And that colors everything. And then, you know, when you see things in that light, it really explains a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I find it fascinating that, you know, these cultures are on opposite ends of the planet, but they seem to have come up with similar kind of systems and ways of doing things and realizations that they've can, you know, use to kind of used as a, I guess, lens to look out into the world or into themselves. And there seems to be these kind of patterns through not only the ways that they reach these states. Seems like those ways are, to me anyways, it seems as though they're pushing yourself to exhaustion in one way or another, but also you know what's come from those states and those insights that have occurred, like you mentioned, they didn't really have any other way. I find that fascinating.
I think a lot of it is rooted in our biology too, right? Where a lot of these cultures, they employ similar methods because they're drawn naturally to what works. And because we all share a fundamental biology, it follows naturally that they would find similar methods. But I think the really interesting thing, or the really surprising thing, is when you find people, populations separated by thousands of miles or thousands of years, or separated by language, coming to similar conclusions as to what they observe in those altered states of consciousness. This is really the foundation, you might say, of the Jungian archetypes, where you're looking at the unconscious, you're looking at the nature of mind, and you're noticing these trends, these consistent observations that crop up everywhere. And that's very, very powerful. And it's a mystery, right? I mean, if you take the skeptical, atheistic approach of saying, well, it's all hooey, it's all nonsense, well, then you're left with a very big dilemma, because how do you explain these continuities? How do you explain these cultural parallels in societies that have never been in contact with one another? And that for me is a very powerful insight when it comes to perennialism and these sorts of ideas.
I find it interesting how when we look at kind of if we take all of that and we put it together in a big bowl, and then we get another bowl that has kind of what's going on right now, like what is actually happening across the world, and from all the perspectives you could look at that question from, and just to kind of take a glance at what's kind of emerging and the connection between the two, the way that we're kind of in a sense we're going through a passage at the moment, and there's this almost this feeling of like a reconnection, like we've advanced in so many different ways, but these cultures that a lot of us may see as primitive, they're actually, they seem to be more advanced in if we're talking about the mind, for example, instead of, the kinds of things that we're advanced in, where almost it feels as though the mind's kind of taken over because we haven't been able to understand it as much as maybe some of these other cultures have. And that may be due to, this is going out on a bit of a limb, but it might be due to these states and these, ancient ways of absorbing and finding knowledge and kind of applying that we've in some way neglected because of the trajectory that, the recent couple of 100 years has been on.
Yeah, it's very true. It's, I think a big part of it is that over the last, I would say probably well over 1,000 years, there's been a tremendous resurgence of, what I've heard sometimes called Aristotelian logic. The ancient Greeks were really the very first to take that kind of a state of mind. You have all, for instance, the ancient Greek myths, that are clearly, mystical and mythological. But in the midst of that, Plato and Aristotle and the great minds of those early Greek philosophers, they attempted to make sense out of the world by completely ignoring mythology, ignoring altered states of consciousness, and relying almost exclusively on reason and a very clear problem-solving, sober state of consciousness, almost sober to the extreme, where your mind is very rigorous. And with the takeover of Christianity in the Roman period, that Aristotelian mode of consciousness, that rational mode of consciousness, sort of went underground for quite a while. But then in the Middle Ages, it had an enormous resurgence. Oh, what is going on?
You can grab that.
No, it's somebody's paging it. Yeah, I don't know. I'll just set that here.
So you were talking about the resurgence?
Yeah. So the in the Middle Ages, you had, this major resurgence of Greek ideas, Greek logic. The Greek language was really rediscovered by Western Europeans around the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. And then when the Catholic Church took over Spain from the Moors, and they translated all of those books from Arabic into English, or rather into Latin and French, there was this tremendous resurgence of scholasticism, of scholarly work. Of course, we call this the Renaissance, right? It was the rebirth of Greek reason. And in some sense, Western man became addicted to that because we saw its potential, we saw its power. And, it was totally justified because, I'm speaking to you right now instantly, and you're on the other side of the world. This is the power of technology. So it's certainly valuable. But I think now that what has happened is at the far end of this, now that we're in the 21st century, there's been a recognition that with all this knowledge, there are still some very fundamental questions about ourselves that we have no idea about. Like, for instance, what is consciousness? What happens when people die? What are dreams made out of? These seem like very rudimentary, childlike questions. Why is the sky blue? And yet we have no idea. And science has largely ignored these things, and it's been content to essentially bypass them or to offer very unsatisfactory, superficial answers. I've seen this quite a lot in science, where serious academics will take some of these deeply profound mysteries, and for fear of acquiring a bad reputation, they will, what's the word I'm looking for? They'll sort of minimalize it, or make it sound very dull, and try to avoid anything that sounds mysterious for fear that they might be associated with woo mysticism, or the goofiness of spirituality, right? So there's, I think, a big cultural interest in these things today because we're aware of this now. We're looking around and we're saying, hey, there's something here and it's worth looking into. The mind is not just the brain. I think we're becoming more and more aware of that.
Yeah, it is quite interesting how just a thought, what comes to me right now is just this idea of this change. It seems to be a shift within science as well, and you can see people kind of stepping out, in spite of those common kind of perceptions of this kind of stuff being really woo. They're stepping out and taking a chance and exploring some of these areas, and that's really kind of exciting stuff. There's also a part of me that feels like, I had a realization a few years ago, and it was this idea of like not needing to know everything. Like all my life, I've really wanted so many answers for so many things, and I guess that's really made me suffer and has been a bit of a weight on my shoulders. And this idea of kind of letting go of that and just accepting what is and just being in awe of everything, brings me, a sense of peace. It's like, why do we need anything more special? People ask for interesting stories all the time, but there's so much beauty all around us, and just to be able to, realize that beauty and to accept it without having to know the reason behind it all. I feel like that could be quite liberating as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have felt that way. I know it's been a kind of a more recent realization for myself as well, where the scientific process and the inquisitive Western mind, is very, as much as it's inspired by curiosity, it's also incredibly harmful. I'm reminded here. I just showed the kids here the other day the old Jurassic Park movie from the 90s. And there's one scene in there where he says, I can't remember the exact words, but he says, what you call scientific inquiry is what I call the rape of the natural world. And it's very true. Like I think about the fact, I've been studying ancient Egypt quite a lot here lately, and we discover a tomb and we can't not open it. We must open it. We have to tear it apart, take everything out, clear away all the dust, take pictures of everything, dismember, disassemble. It's in some sense very violent, the things that we do to understand and to try to comprehend the world around us. And that's a thing that's often overlooked, that people, they think as long as it's inspired by curiosity, it's okay, but that's a very Western notion. and it's very iconoclastic in the sense that there's nothing sacred to us. We have no problem, disassembling and tearing things apart just to understand them a little better. And it's the example of dissecting a toad. I mean, you want to know how it works, but in the process you kill that frog, and oftentimes we don't think about that. We're too busy trying to know, which in a big way, life is, I think, in many ways more about living in the mystery and accepting the not knowing. It's difficult, but it takes faith to do that.
So where are you at the moment with your explorations, and is there anything in particular that's kind of exciting you? You mentioned Egypt and kind of the study into that.
Yeah, well, right now what I'm doing is I'm organizing my program called Enlighten University. It's a website that I put together for my subscribers, and my goal is essentially to take the students through an educational program that starts from the earliest roots of religion all the way up into modern concerns and modern ideas. And so that's really, it's a lot of work. It's I have to take these big tomes, these big books, and try to condense them down into 6 or 7 half-hour lectures. And it's good though. Many of the books that I'm reading are books that I've wanted to really dive into. I've known about them, but for my own curiosity, I looked at it and said, it's too much work. If I'm just doing it for me, it's too much work. But now that I have the university, it's great, because it's like, okay, now I have to do it. I have to dig in there and really learn about all this to share it and know it. So.
And is that something you would just like?
Right now,
how did that come up?
Greek myth.
How did this?
We're just going to be finishing. I'm actually going on to the pyramid text.
Okay.
Pyramid text next. So that'll be interesting.
The pyramid text, is that like a sacred book from ancient Egypt?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. The like if you look at the pyramid of Giza or the pyramid of Merenre or any of those guys, the oldest pyramids, you go into the tombs and they're completely empty. There's no inscriptions on the walls whatsoever. And a lot of people say, well, that's weird. Well, no, it's not actually. It was the norm in early Egypt. It was not until the reign of Pharaoh Unas, I believe it was in the 4th dynasty, that the Egyptians started to inscribe the walls with all these spells. They'd have hundreds of spells that they would inscribe on the walls all around the king. And essentially what the spells were designed to do was to lead the pharaoh through the afterlife into an experience of union with the sun, where he would be reborn as Ra or Osiris, the sun god, and then reign in the afterlife as a king as well. So it's one of the oldest books in the world. In fact, it might be the oldest book in the world, the pyramid text. It's fascinating. It's really interesting stuff.
Well, and you've got a copy of this book.
Yeah, I've got a translation right over there. It's I read through it, but it's dense. That's the thing about ancient texts, right? Is that, I mean, they tend to be oftentimes repetitious, very hard to understand. But yeah, I slugged my way through it, and there's some interesting insights, but you've really got to chisel away to get at them.
Yeah, well, that probably makes them worth a little bit more, I guess, and that the kind of journey to those insights helps them kind of be absorbed. I feel that seems to be something that happens in a lot of different ways. I've been into vibration recently, and I've been getting this feeling to kind of write a book about it from different perspectives and explore it myself. And just during my research recently, I found that there's this, I can't remember the name of it. It's like this ancient Egyptian, it seems like a shaker. You probably know what I'm talking about, and it creates this certain kind of vibratory energy. And
the sistrum.
Sistrum, yeah, I found that quite interesting, and even the way some of the pyramids or spaces were designed to really bring about a certain vibrational quality with the frequency and how the waves kind of ricochet around, and yeah, I found that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, it is interesting. I know I watched a video about the some of the pyramids in Egypt, and people going through them, and the echo you get to those spaces is pretty intense. Yeah, it's very ominous.
Yeah.
Very ominous echo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So while I was doing my research, I noticed that you've got quite a few interesting videos that link up to topics that I'm really fascinated in. I mean, you mentioned Jung earlier, and this idea of the collective unconscious and the archetypes, and I feel like even that connects with what you mentioned about the hero's journey as well, and Joseph Campbell's work. And I had recently a Jungian analyst on the show, and we were talking about the idea of the shadow and integrating these kind of darker sides of our psyche, and following the soul's calling, I guess, in whatever direction that may be. And we also kind of touched on, a few different elements, like synchronicity and the idea of dreams, and this strange connection between, intrapsyche phenomena when you're kind of sleeping and what happens when you're awake. Have you explored any of those areas at all?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a big part of my research. Where Jung's research is really, in some sense, I'm kind of jealous. I feel as if Jung really was the Isaac Newton of religion. I mean, he really he provided for the very first time a system for understanding religion that sort of allowed us to walk away from dogmatism and rigid ideological thinking, and really kind of approach the religious experience in a more scientific manner. And I think the big thing that he's found is that the psyche is a reality unto itself, and that is huge. I mean, it's really, I don't know, I'm sure that a lot of people hear about Jung's ideas, but I don't think that probably impresses itself on people enough, is to understand that what Jung really was saying is that the mind is something completely different. It's so other, it's so unique that you really cannot reduce it to just physical, connections in the brain. I mean, the Jungian archetypes and different characters that you meet in dreams, they appear to be autonomous. I'm reminded, actually, I was just putting together lecture 5 here based on Jungian archetypes. And one of the students has been reading through the Red Book that Jung wrote. And there's this wonderful conversation in there. And I actually had him send me a screenshot of it so that I can include it in the presentation, where Jung is having a discussion with Elijah and Mary. And he explains to Elijah and to Mary, he says, well, you're merely projections of my mind, right? Speaking as a psychoanalyst, he says, I understand this is all an illusion, and you're just sort of figments of my imagination. And Elijah says, we are as real as you. And he says, you confuse me. He says, do you mean to say that you wish to be real? And Elijah says, no, you may call us projections of your mind, but that in no way negates our reality. And, it's a very sophisticated conversation Jung was having in a dream, where these individuals in the dream are explaining to him, no, you're wrong. We are real. It's a profound thing. I know in my own case, when I was really first introduced to Jungian psychology, there was a very simple phrase that Jung said in one of his interviews, where he talked about precognitive dreams, and he stated that it was simply a fact. He says, it's a fact that people will dream about the future. We know this. He stated it as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. And for me at the time, I was an atheist. It was full stop. That's having dreams about the future is enormously significant, because what it suggests is that the mind, in some sense, transcends time, or that it is somehow independent of the physical laws of our immediate reality. And that was such a big message for me, that I started recording my dreams and paying very close attention. And I remember, I came to the point where I realized, well, perhaps, recording my dreams isn't enough. Maybe I need to pray to some higher intelligence, asking for some kind of a dream about the future. And I thought, maybe these things are not just going to, coincidentally happen. I may have to appeal to some kind of a higher intelligence. And as an atheist, that was deeply offensive at the time. I'd put off the whole idea of God, and here, thanks to Carl Jung, I was, considering the invitation to pray.
But you were open enough to do it as well, and that's worth mentioning, I think.
Yeah, and it's funny because I had a very short debate with myself where I said, well, the important thing here is to understand the way things are, and to hell with how I feel about it. I mean, just because I think I'm an atheist doesn't mean anything. What's important is coming to a firm and logical understanding of the way things are. That's what matters, right? And so I just put that part of myself aside and said, we're not listening to that. And so I prayed. And sure enough, I had a dream about standing in a store, and I seen these people in orange smocks, and they were all talking among themselves. It was a very short dream, but it was very vivid and felt very real. And at the time, I happened to be looking for work. I was trying to get a job in a hardware store. And so I took the dream as maybe a piece of advice to go and apply at Totem, because at Totem, they wear orange smocks. I put in a resume. Nothing came of it. They never called me. I thought, the dream was hooey, and I gave up on the whole project, right? Well, a few months later, I got a job at Home Depot where they wear orange smocks, and I still didn't think of it. It was, kind of in the past now enough that I'd forgotten all about it. And then the one day I'm standing there, and I look over and I see these people in orange smocks, and this moment of deja vu hits me, and I go, oh, I've seen this before. And I remembered the dream. I knew that it was the dream. And wow, that was the end of my... that was really the firm end of my skepticism and atheistic sort of materialist thinking, where I said, okay, Jung is right. The mind has a reality all its own. It is an independent thing that doesn't simply arise from brain activity. It was profound.
It's interesting how you seem to have invited that experience in by asking for it through the prayer, especially as an atheist. I mean, that seems like a big step, like we touched on. So just from conversations I've been having recently with friends and their own kind of experiences, it seems to be the case that once you're open to things and once you kind of invite them in, it opens up the possibilities. And, you mentioned wanting a firm and kind of, it seemed quite rigid kind of sense of truth that you were seeking. You were willing to kind of go over anything to get there. But I like the idea of also, you mentioned in the beginning of our chat, this idea of you being really skeptical about a lot of things and questioning a lot of things, and not really, holding on to, all your beliefs with dear life. There's this idea that that's kind of happened recently, and coming back to kind of these ancient cultures, this kind of fluidity of, the way things are, and this openness to maybe see things differently than you may have originally thought, seems to be a significant thing to mention.
Yeah, I think, in studying different religious groups, I've seen it a lot where, people will hold on to a certain set of ideas. I'll give you a perfect example here. My wife and I, we've recently moved into the house here in Red Deer, and due to COVID, I was laid off. And so we've been having some income issues, with work and everything else. So we decided we move in with my mother-in-law to save some money. And it's been interesting. She comes from old Africa. She's from South Sudan. And, I've been saying, well, we need to teach my wife's brother how to cook. He's, 16, 17. He's going to be on his own. And she says, no, she says, in my country, if a man cooks, people die.
Really?
That's the old, and they have these traditional values where, I often suggest things where I say, well, we need to do this or we need to do that. And in response, she simply offers the tradition, that no, in my country, we don't do things that way. Well, it's interesting, right? Because from a Western point of view, we largely, I think, for the most part, understand that those kinds of beliefs are essentially worthless. I mean, they don't hold any value. And I often find it strange how with religion, we don't seem to see that. I mean, if you believe something spiritually that isn't true, it's quite simply a worthless belief. I mean, it has no value.
I
A
guess
belief that isn't
it
true.
becomes who you are, right? It becomes your sense
Yeah.
of identifying, and if someone challenges that, I mean, what
Yeah,
else do you have, really?
it's so weird to if you really stop and think about it. I mean, people will become so rigidly attached to a set of beliefs, as you mentioned, because it informs who they are. But even when you show them that that belief is simply not true, they'll still hold on to it simply to reinforce this sense of self. But fundamentally, you've now put a crack in your identity because your identity is built on something that's false, right? And I, when I was younger, I saw that quite clearly, that correct beliefs and a correct understanding of the way things are is absolutely essential. And there's zero value beyond immediate comfort in holding on to a false belief. And, if I think more people took that approach with their religious beliefs, religion could move forward much more quickly. But it's largely held back because many people hold false beliefs because it makes them feel better. But it's such a worthless thing to do because, I mean, yeah, if you believe, I don't know, if you believe that it's going to rain tomorrow and make all these plans about that, and then it doesn't rain. I mean, it's a worthless venture. I mean, you haven't accomplished anything, right? But just because it makes you feel good, you do it anyways. Well, that's the irrationality of impulsive behavior, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Religion is such a touchy subject, and partly because of the reasons you've just highlighted. I guess there's also these. I don't know. There's certain characters you meet in certain circles. There seems to be. Well, I just remember I have this memory when I was a kid, and it was like my mother's, one of my mother's best friends, their husband or something, and we were at some kind of social setting. I think it was like some kind of a Hungarian dance or something, or someone's wedding. I don't know. And there was just this guy. I was just a kid, and he was like, he came over and he started kind of preaching kind of the word of God, and he started kind of really intensely to like an 8-year-old kid, trying to convert me to whatever kind of religion he was into. And I've met a few of those characters in my time, and there seems to be, I don't know, this real kind of wanting to focus on others, sometimes even without focusing inwards. And I don't know, I just feel like, just by looking at this idea of vibes recently, just linking this up a little bit, I've been looking at kind of how to tune into the vibes or the rhythm of what's going on, and whatever that may mean. I've been exploring that, and then how to sync up with that, and then how to actually radiate that outwards once you are aligned. And everything I've been looking at kind of comes back to doing work within, and then having that naturally overflow rather than trying to force something out onto other people. So I've been trying to kind of.
What you're saying reminds me a lot of the words of Saint Francis of Assisi. It's one of my favorite quotes. He said, "Preach the gospel always, and when absolutely necessary, use words." In other words, the life that you're leading is the way that you communicate Christ to other people, not the words that you're saying. And it's sad how many Christians and religious people today have sort of turned Christianity and a lot of Western religions more into a virus than anything else. It's not actually enriching the life of the individual. It just sort of moves from person to person and uses up energy. I mean, that's what a virus does, right? And I think a lot of atheists and a lot of skeptics and critics of religion, they see that. Whereas oftentimes the converts can't. They can't see that, this religious belief is making them anxious, making them rude, making them less happy. It's just burning energy, and it refers to nothing that's immediately true in their lives. I mean, they're convincing themselves the apocalypse is coming, but it doesn't happen. The world carries on, and they feel this urgent need to push these ideas on others, and it's essentially like a virus. It's taking something which is rich and beautiful and sincere, and just sort of turning it into something noxious and cruel sometimes.
Yeah, this idea of a virus just, of course, makes me think about everything that's going on at the moment, and even the ideas that are being pushed around, in every direction, in the atmosphere at the moment. And it's just kind of, I don't know, I guess, do you have any techniques that you utilize in your own life that kind of bring you back into yourself, or that you've kind of maybe milked or gathered from these different areas of study through history and religion?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it. Actually, I just recently did a presentation on the work of Dr. Paul Dobransky, who is not a particularly well-known figure. I was actually introduced to him when I was a pickup artist, and I was learning how to get with girls and these sorts of things. That was when I was in my younger years. And there was this guy, David D'Angelo, who had him on as a psychologist. And I think he actually is a student of Jungian ideas. Of course, this was before I knew anything about Jung.
Mm.
This was when I was still an atheist. But a lot of the things I learned there were incredibly useful, where he explains how, we have to visualize ourselves as having a kind of personal boundary. So within your personal boundary, you have 100% control of what's happening, and outside of your personal boundary, you have 0% control. So, if I want to change something in my life, go to the gym, work out more, that's 100% in my control. Being able to change, the neighbor Susie's attitude about mowing her grass is not going to be in my control. So these are the things where you have to recognize what's in your control and what's not. And he talks about how this personal boundary is like a permeable membrane, and it's permeable to the things we say yes and no to. So in relationships, when you meet somebody and you like them, you open all the doors in your personal boundary. Yeah, come over. It's okay. Yeah, you can borrow that. Oh, I want to be your friend. I agree with you. Yes, 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 right? We open all these doors. But oftentimes what that will do is it will create contempt in the other person. They learn not to respect you. They start to walk all over your personal boundary. We use little things in our language, like, for instance, if you say, that individual over there, he really pushes my buttons, or that woman, she really gets under my skin. These are all metaphorical references to this notion of a personal boundary. And so the essential thing for mental health and a mature ego is to get comfortable with hearing no and saying no. You have to identify who you are and what it is that's important to you, and then recognize where you have control in your life. And then simply where you find something that you don't like, you simply put doors in the way of that. So if you have a relationship with somebody that's toxic, they're not treating you the way you want to be treated, you have to get comfortable with saying no. But you also have to get comfortable with hearing no, because maybe you have a friend in your life who has a healthy boundary, that knows who they are, knows what they value, and they tell you no. Well, sometimes that can make people with a weak boundary feel nervous or uncomfortable, because they feel, well, it's confrontational to say no. But really, that's not the case. That's how mature people communicate. Yeah, it's the notion of personal boundaries and getting comfortable with hearing no and saying no. And it's very important for mental health, very important for relationships. One of the things I've seen, in relationships, romantic relationships, where you'll get a lot of fighting, a lot of squabbling, it's often due to boundary issues, where the individual will consider themselves entitled to something in the other individual's boundaries. So, for instance, you may be married, and then, your wife grabs your keys and grabs you the car and takes it into town. And it turns out that, you had to do some work on the car, and you say, well, why didn't you come and ask me before you used my car? Well, I shouldn't have to. And then the fight goes. It's this idea of, in relationships, we have to set these firm personal boundaries where we let other people know how it is we wish to be treated, what it is that we believe is important, and to respect those boundaries. It's very difficult, but it's the mark of all mature relationships. And I find just that it's very practical, it's very simple, but just being aware of that and implementing it can make a huge difference in your quality of life. It's a lot of times
No, sorry, I'll let you go.
Oh no. Yeah, I was just going to say, a lot of times we we allow people to step on our boundaries and to do things that we don't like because we want to be friends with them and we don't want to upset them. But usually that's not so wise.
Yeah, I've definitely had this exact experience in one of my relationships, like my current one, actually, in the early stages. But yeah, it just reminds me of a thought I was having yesterday, and that thought is kind of, it ties up in a weird way, but it's kind of like, look at your life for a moment. Look at the things that you do. Look at the things the choices that you make, and I guess in this sense, the boundaries that you put up, and kind of what you're constructing, how you construct your days. Because everything at the end of the day is although it might be informed by certain levels of conditioning and upbringing and your environment, a lot of what's happening is actually your choice. And once we look at that, we're able to see, coming back to this idea that we're talking about, this mystical idea, that this revelation you had with Jung, we're actually kind of creating things. We're creating everything around us all the time, and we've got the power. I mean, if our mind, if it so clearly has the power to, have things happen, strange things happen, like deja vu, or have dreams about the future, or, I heard a conversation with Stan Groff. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He wrote a book on LSD, and he's done like over 4,500 sessions with, in a kind of, I guess in a psychological setting where he was studying kind of the effects on people and looking at different patterns and associations throughout thousands of experiences. And he was talking about one really peculiar experience that he had. I think it was on the Tim Ferriss show about a year ago, and he was talking about this idea of kind of being able to reach a point, this unbelievable kind of realization that he's able to travel anywhere. He's able to do anything in any moment. And it's something that it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around, but it connects to these shamanic traditions. You look at a lot of them, and they have, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but they have these certain rituals where they may go into some sort of a cave or some sort of a hole, and they're able to kind of transport themselves, to different parts of the world psychically, and they're able to kind of do these things that you hear and you're just like, that sounds like bullshit, but they're able to actually, have these kinds of experiences on the other side of things, and bring back knowledge from them, and then, useful stuff. And then, like we were talking about earlier, that all kind of connects with different traditions around the world. But I guess the thing that I was thinking about the other day was really this idea of forming our own reality, forming our lives by the things that we choose to participate in, by the different choices we make, by the ways we decide to live. We're actually building our life in every moment. And it sounds pretty obvious, but it's not really something I feel a lot of us are taking action on, and something I definitely haven't been in the past. I'd talk about a lot of things, but actually walking the walk and the challenge of keeping that walk up despite the different kind of experiences and challenges and struggles that come up is becoming more what life's about for me at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to hold those beliefs, or to sustain them, especially when things go very much in the direction you don't want. I know, I've had these very clear experiences where, I've wished for something or prayed for something, and then gotten exactly what it was that I'd wished for or prayed for. It's interesting, actually, this way of saying it, wish for, something I learned in Buddhism. They don't really pray for things, they wish for things. And it really does work. It's creepy in a way. But oftentimes what you'll also find is that, when you wish for something, you'll get what you hoped for, but it will always come with something you didn't plan or you didn't want. In fact, this is one of my favorite Hindu stories, called the wish fulfilling tree. And if you mind, or if you don't mind, I'll tell you.
Please do.
It's a lovely little story. It says that there was a group of children, and they were all playing in a house, and their uncle comes and he says, "Oh, it's lovely, children, that you've got these toys, but no one's told you about the magical tree in the yard." And the kids, they say, no, what do you mean, uncle? And he says, well, I should tell you, there's this tree outside. And if you go to the tree, you wish for anything you want, and the tree will give it to you. And so right away, all the children go rushing out of the house, and they go to the tree. And of course, they wish for candy and toys and all these wonderful things, and the tree provides them. But with the toys, they also inherit boredom. And with the candy, they get stomach aches. And they say, well, that's not very good. So then they say, well, let's wish a little better this time. So this time they wish for popularity and friends and boyfriends and girlfriends. And, you know, with that, they inherit jealousy and fear and quarreling and fighting. And so I say, well, that's not right. We need to wish better again. And so this time they wish for spouses and children and houses and cars and all these things, you know. And with that, they inherit responsibility and burdens and anxieties, and that, you know, these things don't satisfy them at all. And, you know, some of the children, they say, oh, this tree is a curse, you know, it's life is worthless, it's all no good, and so they kill themselves. But the Hindu story says, but where can anyone be born except again at the feet of the wish-fulfilling tree? And, you know, others keep wishing and wishing and just ignore the negative consequences and carry on. But the story says all while this is going on, a small handicapped boy is sitting in the house. He you know, he's in a wheelchair, he can't use his legs. And so at a distance, he's watching all of this. And he says to himself, those poor fools, he says, they don't understand that every time they wish for something, they get an equal portion of suffering along with it. And so he slowly makes his way out to the tree. And he says, I wish that these beings would find lasting happiness. And the Hindu story ends by saying, and that one became the enlightened being, you know. So this is the idea of our material reality. We certainly have the ability to create it, but yeah, the flip side is that the wish-fulfilling tree always gives us an equal portion of suffering to go along with our wishes.
Unless you're like that boy with the broken legs who can kind of use your wishes and your, I guess, the creation of your life to in some way serve others. I mean, that's what it seems like the message is. And that seems like something that really comes through to me in a lot of different ways as the way to go, I guess. Like, you know, like looking at how you can, you know, serve others, looking at your friendships rather than what you can take and is what you can give to them. And that's why I guess this idea of, I don't know, the idea of like a gift economy really excites me, or the idea of, you know, trading with one another and, you know, finding ways to, I guess, in a sense, maybe not better yourself, but in a sense, kind of just connect to who you really are, or remember who you really are, so that, you know, you're able to kind of pass that on to other people and bring a nice sense of, I don't know, like a good feeling to others. I think that's where this whole idea of doing good for others is good for you. I had an interesting conversation with a guy that, I think that was the title of his book actually, and he kind of talked about it, you know, even from a health perspective, physiological changes when you do good for others, and you know, how your life changes. But there is this interesting consideration about, you know, just as there's so much good with something, there's also an equal amount of bad, for lack of a better way of putting it. This kind of contrast, this balance, this yin and yang, and a sense of acceptance of that as well, seems to be pretty important on the journey.
Yeah, it's very liberating. I know that for me, you know, the realization of that and seeing it in my life, where, yeah, I've gotten exactly what I hoped for, but it just wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be, or there wasn't, you know, things didn't go the way I'd hoped they would. And just being aware of this, like you mentioned, being the yin and yang. And I think ultimately, you know, from my own mystical experiences, the experiences I've had, most especially, I had like a near-death experience on LSD. And there was one point where I felt myself to be the deity Vishnu in Hindu myth. And I was having a conversation with Shiva, and Shiva explained to me very clearly, he said, you know, all these misfortunes that you suffer in life have a very particular purpose. It's intended to detach you from the dream so that you can re-arrive back to this place of remembering who you really are. You know, as if to say, if the dream were always good, you'd hold on to it and never let go, and you would completely forget that you are in fact God dreaming. And I had this sense that, you know, the personification of chaos, in this case Shiva, was explaining that it was his job in the universe to make sure that everything fails, everything dissolves, everything goes to hell. And that forces us as divine dreamers, if you will, to wake up and to become enlightened and to realize, oh, that's right, it's only a dream, and secretly I'm the dreamer. You know, because that's the safety valve, I guess you might say.
Yeah, it's like there needs to almost be this sense of destruction and rebirth for the cycle to go on. Otherwise, it's just kind of, you know, and that seems to be a common theme within religion as well. Different religions, this idea of death, rebirth, the cyclical kind of vibe of things, I guess. I wanted to ask you about your book, The Way of the Dream. What's going on with that? Tell me a little bit about.
Well, it's an autobiography. I wrote it, what was it now, 2 years ago or a year ago? I published it in December of last year, I believe it was. And it mostly recounts my journey, my story. I talk about my childhood and the experiences I had. But the book is really, the purpose behind it is to show people, I guess you might say, what I consider to be, at least in my case, what a real spiritual life can look like, in the sense of being messy and chaotic and, you know, not, you know, there's a whole section of the book where I am very generously, how would you say, honest, you know, painfully honest about my flaws, about mistakes I made, you know, embarrassing situations, you know, the confusion I went through being a Christian, being an atheist, being a Buddhist. And, you know, there's points in the book where, you know, you'll read about my character and you'll think, oh, what a wonderful guy. And then other points you think, what a scoundrel. And I really wanted to convey, you know, the messiness of what a spiritual life looks like. I know that, you know, now that I teach on YouTube and now that I present to people, I know that a lot of my subscribers look up to me as a spiritual teacher, as a kind of guru. But I really have no desire of presenting myself as a saint or, you know, a perfect individual. It's simply not true. And I think it's very valuable to share my story with the flaws and to say, you know, if you're going through these things, it's okay, because I've went through them too. And if I'm going to be a spiritual teacher, I guess you could say that's the kind of spiritual teacher I'd like to be, not up on a pedestal saying, you know, look at me and try to be like me, but really in the trenches, you know, and say, hey, I'm like you. I've got bad habits. I've got flaws, but let's move towards this goal together and try to achieve something.
Yeah, that sounds really cool, man. That sounds like it would be an amazing read, just to kind of go through that and to be able to kind of relate with some of those things. Because I noticed that, you know, a lot of the things that I'm going through, a lot of people are going through that, and there seems to be a real connection and a real reunion element. Brings us together a little bit more when we can feel into other people's experiences. Can you tell me a little bit about your, I'm not sure if obsession is the right word, but your interest in astronomy?
Oh yeah, wow. It's I think it, you know, I was actually interested in astronomy before religion, but I think it runs in the same vein of the big picture, you know, trying to understand what's going on, where are we, you know, what's the big picture with all of this. That seems to be my big thing, you know, even when I teach, you know, I tend to start with the big picture and then narrow in on the details. You know, I like to get that broad sense of understanding the world and then fill in the rest as we go. And so for me, astronomy is, well, first off, it's incredibly nurturing in the sense that it gives you a context or a sense of where you are in the universe, but it's also incredibly liberating, because when, you know, every night when I look through my telescope and I just see how vast the universe is, it fills my mind with possibilities. And, you know, I guess that's something that was Buddhist about me all along. You know, the Buddhists, they often say, when you look at an empty room, don't see it as empty, see it as full of potential. You know, there's just total potential there. You know, as soon as you fill it full of stuff, well, now you've taken all the potential away. Now you're stuck with what you have, right? But as long as it's empty, there's just nothing but potential. And when you look up into the universe, many people see so much emptiness and so much void and just, vastness, but really it's just filled with imaginative potential. I mean, every star could harbor worlds with beings that, we can't even imagine, beings who live lives that we wouldn't even be able to comprehend. I mean, it's just, it's a trip in itself.
It definitely is. And every time I look out recently, I've found that I'm kind of almost looking in a way, like I'm kind of looking out at the stars, but that gives me this real kind of deep, profound moment of really kind of introspection and just kind of being, almost feeling like I'm one with everything, just kind of in awe of the mystery of everything.
Well, and it's funny you could mention that, because that's something that's very particular. Many myths will identify a region like that. So for instance, in the old myths, you would say, well, over the mountains there's a land, and in that land, there are all these magical beings. Like in Middle Age times, they'd say, beyond here monsters be found, or things like this, right? Really what it was describing is, because no one knew what was there,
unknown, yeah.
It was a region where the imagination could just run free, and you could project out all these things. Well, the earth has been circumnavigated several times. I mean, we have Google Earth, you can zoom right in on your house, but space is still largely unexplored. So when we look up, it's one of the few spaces that we still have left where we can really let the imagination run free. And I think that's why films like Star Wars and things of that kind really catch on with people, because it's believable, because anything is possible in the stars, right?
Yeah.
We don't know what's up there. So
exactly, that kind of infinite amount of potentiality, and that the beauty of that within our own lives is something kind of worth being with. I like the idea of kind of thinking about that, and I like when I find that I get into that state. It feels nice. It feels like exciting. It feels like who knows where things could go, and it feels like we're just getting started in a way.
I'm reminded of Lama Ole Nidal, my former Buddhist teacher. He used to talk about that, where he says, if you sit down with unhappy people, you'll often find that they use language like, oh, this is very real, or these are the hard facts of life, and they speak with very solid language. They have a very solid, rigid way of thinking, whereas happy people tend to speak with very airy language, very dreamy language. Well, anything is possible, right? If you really wish it, it can be, this kind of a light, dreamlike kind of communication, right? So yeah, it's very difficult in life, because we often feel trapped, we often feel hemmed in, prisoners of our own little reality, our poverty, our mortality, whatever it may be. But I find that a simple thing like meditation or prayer or going out and looking at the stars can really set your heart free and remind you that you're part of something much bigger, and that your current situation will pass, and you got to really embrace that vastness each and every day as much as you can.
Yeah, there's something really potent in there. There's that little piece of knowledge, and I really want to share my appreciation with you, kind of sharing so much of this wisdom that you've kind of gathered up. This idea of recognizing that everything is always in a constant state of change, and in every moment is shifting, even if we might not be able to perceive those shifts, and things work in seasons. And just as we've noticed it before in our lives, like things don't stay the same forever. So if you are in a struggling kind of point wherever you are at the moment, things will change, and there will be a shift in seasons, and it's just kind of about maybe experiencing or feeling into that experience, or surrendering into it, probably is a better way to put it. And then allowing that to pass, rather than trying to force your way out of it, which I think brings more struggle, it seems. Yeah, definitely something beautiful in that thought. So yeah, thanks for sharing everything, Wescott, today. I think it's probably a good time to wrap it up. I've got about 2.5 minutes left on the recorder, but I did want to kind of leave on a nice landing point, and I think that was a beautiful one, to be honest. Yeah.
Good high note.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to kind of, before I let you go, and I feel like we might even cross paths in person one day with our kind of mutual friend of Merenik, because we're keen to do some ceremonies together. We worked in Costa Rica together with ayahuasca, and we did a ceremony in Canada, I think around the area that you're in actually. So we're looking to kind of cross paths again, Merenik and Aidan, and I don't know, it felt really right meeting them in Costa Rica, and it just really felt like we were instant friends. And I feel a similar way with this kind of chat as well. There's this vibe that's been generated. But I wanted to quickly ask you, you know, I am researching this book. I'm in the process of figuring out how to research a book, so I don't really know what I'm doing. But this idea of vibration has caught me, and I want to follow the thread a little bit. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on vibration, and I've been exploring these methods of kind of these ancient methods of getting to these states as well, and how vibration links into that. Do you have anything that comes to mind, you know, when I mention that?
The only thing, well, a couple of things. I know that listening to certain kinds of audio recordings, like, you know, drum beating or binaural beats, can help enter an altered state of consciousness. Personally, myself, when I think of vibrations, I think of emotions mostly, you know, intuitions, and I think of the significance of the you know, the chakras, you know, within the spiritual body that denote different frequencies, you might say, of consciousness. I find that's the useful way of thinking about emotions. It's almost like a vibration or a frequency in consciousness, where when consciousness is in a different state, it tends to, you know, it's almost like a different sound or a different feeling or a different vibe, right? And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting to, you know, think of the whole process of maturation, starting with the lower chakras of attachment, then in adolescence moving into sexuality, the aggression of early young years, and then the heart chakra, usually that's achieved with a family, sometimes self-discipline, and you know, the realization of God, and finally enlightenment. These are, you know, almost like a spectrum, and you'll often see that actually with the chakras. They'll be described as like a rainbow, you know, different frequencies of colors. So I think it's a useful metaphor. I personally myself, I think it's important to be cautious with the word, or with the use of the word vibration, because I do find sometimes it's overused, or, you know, sometimes we can use words so much that they start to lose meaning, you know, where it becomes so vague. You know, you can throw just about anything in there, and I find that's often, unfortunately, the case with the word vibrations. You know, it becomes so vague that, you know, it can become meaningless. But yeah, as long as there's some context, and specifically a discussion on what exactly, you know, is being discussed in a practical sense, you know, things that can be observed, it's very useful. Yeah, and it's a very nice way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, it's just, I guess, my own personal lens, and I've often kind of looked at this spectrum of moods, like in terms of music especially, and just looking at how it's an infinite spectrum, and there's so many slight little tweaks you can make to really adjust the mood, and then, you know, the associations that you might be able to find within that space because of that certain feeling that arises, or that mood from certain sounds and certain vibrations. But it just feels like such a big space to play in, you know, like there are so many different perspectives from a scientific point of view, from music, in terms of art, in terms of, like you mentioned, emotions, chakras, you know, what different kind of through sound, through chanting, there's this primordial sound that comes through, that vibrates through our system, water. There's so many different kind of avenues to take, and I think it's going to be hard to really nail it down, but I'm hoping that it kind of unravels and unfolds on its own once I start asking enough people about it, and exploring these different, you know, something I really found interesting was the idea of these strangely forming patterns within nature, that don't really seem to make much sense, but they're so beautiful to kind of witness and experience. Like have you ever seen a couple of thousand birds kind of flying in unison when they make those really extraordinary kind of shapes in the air, or fish in, you know, scores of fish, or certain types of fireflies that sync up and have like a bit of a light show go on. That seems pretty interesting.
There's a great show actually on Netflix called The Code, where I think his name is Marcus de Sutoy or something like that, and he talks about the mathematics, behind a lot of that, and that's it's one of the things I think is really overlooked and neglected. There's a tremendous amount of spirituality to be seen in math. I'm reminded of the words of Euclid, who said the laws of nature are but the mathematical thoughts of God. And I recall even in my book, I talk about it when I was high as a kite at the time.
While you're writing.
Yeah. Well, no, and I was actually driving, which was a huge mistake, but it turned out okay. This was when I was quite a bit younger, and my girlfriend and we were driving through the mountains, and I was looking out, and I remember seeing Abraham Lake, which is this big, beautiful lake close to where I live. And being as stoned as I was, I looked at it and I could see the clouds, and I could see the snow on the mountains and the water in the lake. And I thought, it's all water. And I'm like, but what's the difference? Well, the water has a certain amount of kinetic energy, heat energy, vibrational energy, and the ice its own, and the clouds its own. So the only real difference between the ice, the clouds, and the water is its frequency, its vibration. And then I had the inspiration to do a painting where everything was in black except the water. And so each level of the water would change, like a rainbow. So I had the lake in like a red, and then the snow in more greens and yellows, and at the top a different color. It turned out to be a lovely painting, but it was just this intuitive insight that I had that was really true of all the world, that everything is made out of the same essential stuff, but fundamentally it just differs in terms of frequency, differs in terms of vibration. And it wasn't until years later that I learned about quantum field theory, and how in a certain sense that's actually true, that really is the way things are. And so being stoned in the mountains, I had this profound insight on the nature of reality.
And everything seems to lead to that one central point of this kind of oneness, I guess, and that seems to flow through everything. And it's really just, how do we actually make use of that? How do we connect with that idea and in some way kind of fall into it and accept it? It's difficult unless I found it personally difficult unless I've been coming from an experiential point of view to kind of imagine and picture and take that on board.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyways, man, I'll let you go. But thanks again. Yeah, this has been good. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Today Dreamer podcast. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. I'm going to leave some links to Westcott's amazing work. His awesome videos on YouTube are definitely worth checking them out, because there's some interesting stuff in there that you can really learn from, and it really tickles your spiritual curiosity, I guess, to dive into someone's work that's really, put some extensive research and attention and intention into what they've produced. So yeah, I'll leave some links for you guys to check that out. It's really cool stuff. And stay tuned, because next week we're going to be speaking to Charles Eisenstein, who's all about oneness and the illusion, stepping away from the illusion of the separate self, to work together in collaboration. So we're going to be talking about some interesting things. I'm going to leave that for next week's episode, but thanks again, and I'll catch you then.